Okay.
So this is going to be recorded?
Yeah. So hopefully it'll work. I mean, we just have a recorder with a kind of a non-directional mic here. But
Well, usually all of them are recorded? Like,
hopefully, yeah. As long as we can make it work.
Okay.
But yeah, so the basic idea for tonight, the first hour's in here, and then unfortunately we couldn't find a single room to have both hours in. So then we have to go over to 370 for the second half. But in the first hour, we're going to talk about a little bit of the history of Darwin and some of the motivations for how he started thinking about natural selection and conceiving of this idea. And you kind of have to learn about Darwin whenever you learn about evolution. It's just what you do. And then we'll talk a little bit about natural selection, a little bit about sexual selection, and then if we have time, we could talk a little bit about speciation, but it's not so important. I think it's better to focus on natural and sexual selection. So there's no real hurry. Please stop me if you have questions at any point. The point here is to get you guys up on anything that you're seeing in lecture that you haven't seen before. So just stop me at any time with a question. All right, any questions before we start? Okay, so let's start a little bit with the history of Darwin. So Darwin was born in 1809, and he did a bunch of different things. He kind of went to medical school and then just stopped going to classes and stopped studying. And he was really interested in natural history. So by natural history, I mean studying plants and animals and living things and how they're relating to the natural world. So at some point, when Darwin is 22, he gets this potential opportunity to go on this sailing trip around South America with the HMS Beagle, and captained by Robert Fitzroy. And here, the ship is going to survey and chart the coast of South America. But he's invited along with the opportunity to just collect animals and plants and make natural history collections, as well as to study some of the geology, because he was very interested in geology at the time. So, and he almost didn't get to go, because when he went and met the captain, this guy, Fitzroy was big into judging people based on their appearance, and he thought that certain physical features meant things about your personality. And so Darwin had a very weak, small nose, and Fitzroy thought that meant that he wasn't going to be like a strong person who was capable of enduring this voyage. And so he almost didn't accept Darwin. But luckily Darwin was like this incredibly enthusiastic, kind of like smart, interesting guy. So he managed to weasel his way on this boat and go on this 5-year trip. So when he was out on the boat, he got to observe a huge diversity of plants and animals. And one place you've probably heard about is the Galapagos Islands, where you've heard of the Darwin's Finches. So when he was in the Galapagos, he actually was collecting a bunch of different birds, as in shooting them and stuffing them and saving them to ship them back to his friends. And he thought he was collecting this big diversity of finches and blackbirds and wrens and grosbeaks they all had different bill shapes and kind of different behaviors and fed in different places. And when he sent these back to an ornithologist that he knew, it turned out that they were actually all finches. And so now he's sort of thinking and puzzling over, well, there's this incredible diversity in appearance among these finches, and it seems to maybe be related to their environment and how this one feeds in a different way from that one. And sort of planting the seed of thinking about diversity and adaptation. And likewise, the mockingbirds on different islands actually turned out to be different species, even though he figured they were all just the same. When he sent them off, the ornithologist pointed out to him that they all had particular differences that defined each one as their own species on the different islands. So he's puzzling over this surprising diversity on these islands. And also, after this journey, he reads an essay by Thomas Malthus, which is arguing that population growth is geometric, whereas resource growth is linear. And so he expects, this was thinking about humans, but he's saying he expects that at some point you should have overpopulation and have this intense struggle for survival. So he's thinking about this diversity, he's thinking about the struggle for survival, and he's working on tons of other stuff at the same time. He's writing lots of geology books. But at some point, so this is much later, in 1958, he gets a letter from Wallace. Wallace is this, 22-year-old natural historian who's not well known at all. He's written some little monographs about things. And Wallace is basically proposing a theory of natural selection, which is what Darwin's been thinking about for the last 15 or so years as well. And Darwin is super excited. He's like, this is great. I think this is a really important paper. And so he, unfortunately, couldn't be in touch with Wallace at the time because Wallace was off doing fieldwork somewhere inaccessible. But he's like, all right, I'm just going to pass on this paper and publish it for Wallace, under Wallace's name. He's not stealing the credit. He just published it for Wallace in the Linnaean Society. And nobody noticed. Like, nobody cared about this paper that was kind of laying out the basics of natural selection. Even at the end of the year, the Linnaean Society remarked, we have published nothing remarkable this year. So, there's a little bit of a right place, right time thing going on here. But this letter from Wallace spurred Darwin to finish his book. And he had originally been planning to write it as part of a really massive book that was just called Natural Selection. But now he distilled down part of it and wrote just a 500-page abstract, which he called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. So this is what we call the origin of species now. And he published this a year after he had gotten that letter from Wallace in 1859. So this book was outrageously popular immediately, and it sold out instantly, and people were buying it, and just households were buying it. Intellectuals wanted to have it on their table to have conversations about after dinner with friends. And though it seems like Wallace got shafted here, he actually was a super nice guy, and so was Darwin, and they were close friends afterwards. And so after Darwin's book came out, there were tons of critiques written, people bashing the book, and Wallace devoted a lot of his time to writing critiques of these critiques. So he just immediately stepped in on Darwin's side and threw himself into supporting Darwin's theory, even though it was he might have, I don't know if he felt a little bitter at night thinking back about how it's now Darwin's theory of natural selection. But yeah, so that's the basic story. There's probably a lot more things that I don't know that are interesting, but it's already kind of a cool story. So how does natural selection work? What do we need to have evolution by natural selection? So this is basically what Darwin laid out, but I'm going to put it more in the framework of the way we talked about it in class, just so we don't have mix-ups in terminology and things like that. So we had 3 prerequisites, 3 requirements for evolution by natural selection. Does anyone want to throw out what any of them are?
Is that the heritability and that stuff?
Right, yeah. So one of them is heritability, and so what does heritability mean? So basically, all it means is that the trait we're looking at has some genetic component. So there's some way that you're going to resemble your parent with respect to this trait. It's some genetic component that can be passed on. All right. What else do we need? Variation. Cool. So, it's not relevant if we have a trait that makes us 5 feet tall, or some trait with a gene that makes us 5 feet tall. If we're all 5 feet tall, selection can't choose between people of different heights because everyone's the same height. So now we have a variable trait, and there's some genetic basis behind it. So we actually have underneath this variability in the trait, we have variability in the genetics in the population. So we're almost there. We need one more thing to have evolution by natural selection. Sure, so you said adaptation? So, to put this a different way, we need there to be an association with fitness. So not only are these traits variable, but different variations of the trait have different fitnesses. So we call this also differential fitness. So, and this is basically the way Darwin laid it out. Not using exactly the same words, but he was thinking about the requirement of a genetic basis or some inherited basis, there being variability, and this variability being linked to fitnesses. Yeah?
Is it variation within the trait, or is it how the trait, or do you express it differently is the variation?
Can you say that again?
Like, is the variation within the trait or the gene, or is there variation in the way people express that trait?
That's a great point. Yeah, so this is about variation between individuals. So it's not about variation, it's variation within the trait as in our genetic differences are producing slightly different variations in different individuals. It's not about variation in your particular expression of the trait at different points in your life or anything like that. It's about variation across the population between individuals. So we have these three conditions, and what this allows to happen is that we now can have the frequencies of different variants changing over time. And that's it. That's what evolution by natural selection is. It's where we have these different variants, and due to differential fitness and the inheritance of these variants, we now can have the frequencies of variants change over time, shifting towards variants that have higher fitness. So we're floating back and forth. We're talking about the trait, but then we're talking about the underlying genetics. So the way we usually put this is we call the observable trait in question the phenotype. And natural selection acts on traits. It acts on these phenotypes. It's not acting directly on the genetics, because the genetics in and of itself, it means nothing. It needs a context. So the genetics might have some effect on a particular trait, and then this trait has some effect on the way the individual interacts with other individuals, or the environment, or predators, or something. But the point here is that natural selection acts on phenotypes, which indirectly filters down to acting on the genetics. And we'll talk a lot more in the second hour about thinking explicitly about the genetics and what we call the genotype. So, what does evolution by natural selection look like in practice? So, it's kind of hard to think about with humans because we're talking about change over generations. And we don't live that long. We can't observe this in our lifetime. It can take tens, hundreds, thousands of generations to see big changes by evolution of natural selection. However, generation times are different for different organisms. So humans are much longer lived than most bacteria, for example. So there are actually great examples in the last 50 years of evolution by natural selection that have been very carefully documented. So one I wanted to focus on today is the evolution of antibiotic resistance. So there's a bacteria called Staphylococcus aureus. And this is a bacteria that naturally lives in our skin and mucous membranes, but it also can be, it can be an infectious disease-causing bacteria, and can lead to skin infections, pneumonia, meningitis, sepsis. It's also a pretty common bacteria in causing food poisoning. And it's been this pretty common source of human infections for the past 70 years or so, for the past hundreds of years. But people have been targeting it with antibiotics for a long time, more than half a century. So in 1943, we started using penicillin to treat staph infections. In 1947, there was already resistance to penicillin in some strains of staph. All right, so we shifted to a different antibiotic, and we started using methicillin. And that ended up having some problems, leading to kidney problems among people, so we switched to oxacillin, which is almost exactly the same thing. And in 1961, methicillin resistance was found. And then we started using vancomycin, and we started finding resistant strains of that by the 90s, and fully resistant strains in 2002. And now, in a given hospital, if someone comes in with a staph infection, we kind of assume that it's already going to be resistant to penicillin, oxacillin, tetracycline, and erythromycin. Like most of the common antibiotics that we use, we'll assume it's already resistant to. And so now we have to use different antibiotics or combinations of different antibiotics to treat it. So I just wanted to draw in a cartoon form how this natural selection process looks over the course of a few generations of these bacteria. Sorry. Okay. So we'll imagine that we start out with some population, and I'm going to use different colors to indicate different types of resistance. So imagine we have this population of bacteria, and the blue ones are just not resistant to any antibiotic. And maybe we have some red one over here that just by chance happens to be resistant to methicillin. So now we start using some penicillin on this infection that someone has. And this is representing that infection. This is the population of bacteria that's inside someone's lungs for this pneumonia infection. So we start using penicillin to treat it, and it's doing great. It's killing off almost all the individuals. But boom, one individual now happens to produce an offspring with a mutation that makes it resistant to penicillin. And a lot of these other ones have died off. That one that was resistant to methicillin, it died off. It's not resistant to penicillin. And we have this small population, but some of them are resistant. So we continue our treatment, and this resistant one increases in frequency over time because it's not doing anything and it has very few other bacteria around. It can just kind of eat up all the resources. So soon enough, we have this population of penicillin-resistant bacteria. So then, all right, we've given up on penicillin, and we want to start using something else. So now we start using methicillin, but it just so happens that before we've completely wiped out this infection, there's a new mutation, and we have some resistant one that produces a few offspring. And most of these other penicillin ones are dead. There's just a few of them left. But over time, when we're just treating with methicillin, the red ones aren't being affected at all. So now we have a new healthy population of methicillin-resistant bacteria. So that's the basic principle. Sometimes there can be standing variation that was already there. So here, if we'd started treating with methicillin, this would have already been ready, kind of pre-adapted to this antibiotic, and it would have been able to rise in frequency quickly. But here we started with penicillin, and a mutation was necessary for the resistance, which then increased in frequency. We switched to a different antibiotic, and a mutation was necessary, and then it increased in frequency. But because these populations are so big, a particular infection might have hundreds of thousands or millions of individuals inside of you. There are many mutants that can arise. So we can have evolution of antibiotic resistance very quickly. Yeah?
Did Darwin present natural selection from a gradualist perspective, or did those interpretations come later?
Like, you're thinking about the gradualist versus big sudden events?
Mm-hmm.
So my understanding is that Darwin was sort of thinking in a gradual way. And because he'd been influenced by gradualism in geology, which was understanding that we can have big changes in the landscape just from these slow processes of wearing and things like that. But yeah.
Looking at those Finches, right? And so you can see like, a few more years it was this. Whereas people looking at long paleontological records, like there was this, and then suddenly there's a squid, and you're looking at different layers of rock. Whereas he was looking at isolated islands, you can see soft tissue differences, you can see all these subtle variations that are more gradual, instead of having to look at this punctuated record, like Stephen Jay Gould, who came up with the punctuated equilibrium interpretation.
Cool. Any other questions?
Sorry, I'm Amy, I'm another TA. I'm not this person talking from
Okay.
So based on this model, could you theoretically go back to using penicillin to treat these bacteria again, or is somehow, or in this model, they're represented that they're still maintaining some kind of penicillin resistance?
So that actually is it can be a complicated question, but the basic answer is that, maybe I shouldn't have drawn them quite this way. Maybe these red X's should really be kind of red and green X's. So as long as it's different genes that are converting the resistance to one and the other, then we'd expect these to be resistant to both. And that is what they find, in modern day staph infections. They are resistant to a whole bunch of these different antibiotics at once. Now, there are some cases where there can actually be trade-offs, where resistance to one, you can't simultaneously have resistance to both, or at least it's harder to evolve resistance to both. And that's been the case, I think, with some HIV treatment. But as a general rule, in this model, we're sort of thinking of cumulatively building newer resistances. So we keep the old resistance as we evolve the new resistance as well.
Sorry, this is kind of backtracking a little bit. But the variability, so you said that means the trait has genetic variability. So is that like if it's heterozygous or homozygous, like the genotype? Is that what you mean?
So when I'm talking about variability, I'm talking about differences between individuals in the population. So,
In their genotype?
right.
Okay.
So, so even though it's still within an individual, we can kind of think of each copy of our chromosome as its own individual. So being heterozygous already is some variability, but the main point here is that different individuals have different copies of the gene that have slightly different functioning.
And the difference is on the level of the genetic sequence, the nucleotides in a row. I mean, that's where initially mutations arise.
Okay.
And then when you have two copies where even one base pair being different, suddenly you have two alleles.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Is that,
Sure. Mm-hmm.
I don't want to butt in. But going back to this, a really cool exercise, I think, in thinking about this is why would bacteria evolve so quickly? And there are multiple reasons, but I think it would be an interesting exercise for you guys to just brainstorm. Why would bacteria evolve so quickly? And there are some obvious reasons and some less obvious reasons.
Death and production rate is really fast.
Very short lifespan. Yeah. But one a little more subtle reason. Think of these are bacteria that people are contracting, that organisms are contracting. Right? What are they dealing with when they infect something? When they infect us, say?
Immune system?
The immune system. you have to think, where do they inhabit? What are the circumstances they live in? And for these endoparasitic viruses and bacteria, they have to deal with an active onslaught of immunity. So it actually benefits them to be highly variable and to be able to shift the sugars and proteins that they put on their membranes to evade immune onslaught.
So it's almost like their history of evolution by natural selection already, as parasites living inside humans, has made them better at adapting quickly to new antibiotics. All right. Any more questions about natural selection? Okay, so now I wanted to touch briefly on sexual selection and just talk about how it's different from natural selection and how to think about it a little bit and why people are thinking about it in the first place. So Darwin actually also wrote a whole huge book about sexual selection that was called The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. And it wasn't just Darwin thinking about this at the time. There were a lot of different people who were puzzling over why are there so many differences in appearance between male and females of so many animals? And why are there these seemingly very exaggerated male traits that we see, such as these huge antlers or crazy curly tail feathers in some birds or things like that? So sexual selection is a little bit different from natural selection because we have to keep track of two things at once now. So we have not only a trait, typically in a male, that is being preferred, but we have to keep track of the fact that there are now preferences among the females. So to begin with, maybe a definition of sexual selection. What's a good definition of sexual selection?
Arbitrary nonsense. In a way. It's a shorter term. So the way to think of sexual selection and natural selection is one is a very longer term, and this can be a very short term, less reliable sort of type of selection, if that makes sense. But that's not really a definition, but it's something that's good to keep in mind when you're thinking about the two forces interacting.
So it's selection on male traits, or not necessarily. So it's selection by mating preferences on traits. And so what does this mean? So we talked a little bit about this sort of example with the elk, these Irish elk, where females happen to prefer males with larger antlers. So the males with the largest antlers get more matings, and they produce more offspring. Now, if these antlers happen to have some genetic basis, still having these requirements like we had for natural selection, then their offspring will have larger antlers, and the population will shift to having larger antlers simply by virtue of this female preference for larger antlers, because the males with larger antlers are producing more offspring. So, but key here was that we had not just the male antlers, but we also had the fact that the females preferred the larger antlers. So, suppose we have a population of redfish. And in this population of redfish, there's no variation in the male trait, but it just so happens that there's some underlying female preference for the color blue. And it's based on the places that females like to forage or something like that. So we have a blue preference in this population. So in this case, if suddenly a blue male arises due to some genetic mutation, then the females are going to go crazy for this blue male, and he's going to get more matings and increase the frequency of this gene in the population. So after some time, we might see a bunch of blue fish in this population. But suppose instead we started with this population of red fish, and the underlying female preference was for red. Now we have a blue male that comes along, and the females don't know what this means. They're like, why is this male blue? What's wrong with him? And this guy doesn't get any matings, in fact does worse, and is not able to increase in frequency in the population, and after some time, we just have a population of all red. So I think that's about all we need to say about sexual selection. The basic idea is that here we're keeping track of the preference as well as the trait. What's up?
Sorry, in class he said like often sexual selection and natural selection are in opposition, but if like the point of selection is to like make your offspring survive, why would they choose for something that's like purposely opposing natural selection?
So there's a lot of different ways to answer this.
There's a really good question up the outside, and we both responded to it. That was exactly that question. So that's written down there.
Yeah. So you should definitely check that out as well. But one way to think about this is that, well, for one, it's not necessarily a choice, right? The reason for this preference might be for something completely different. Maybe there's just important to the sort of cognitive hardwiring of how females perceive the world. They're just always going to be drawn to red. So even if the red is flamboyant and makes you stand out among the green and brown rocks and makes it easier for birds to dive into the water and grab you, if this underlying trait is fixed, this underlying preference, then we can have sexual selection acting in the opposite direction.
A way that I like to think about it, I guess, is that, so if you're of a sex and you want to attract someone of the other sex and you are an organism, what does the other sex want? Almost always. Sometimes parental involvement, but it's almost always good genes. Some kind of good genetic material, right? And as that other organism, you want to somehow signal that you have that. And some of those signals can be reliable, like birds that don't have a lot of parasites will have nicer plumage. And if you don't have a lot of parasites, then it's probably safer to mate with you because you have a better immune system. So that can be a reliable trait. Some traits kind of get slipped in there, and they're sort of reliable, but not. Like, big antlers on some level are adaptive, and you do want them. But when it's this sort of rough, you're taking, and you're trying to pare down an organism's fitness to one or two traits, when you're like an elk or something, I mean, that's all you really have to go on, then it's easy to kind of cheat for a while and sacrifice other parts of your health or other parts of your fitness for this boost in antlers or this boost in color. And while in the short term, it'll boost the amount of offspring you have next generation, if it is in fact a trade-off and your survival is impaired by the fact that you have these things, it'll eventually get evened out in the wash. You know, I mean, you'll boost up for a little bit, but it'll be like a bubble in the economy. It's, you know, the perceived value is not equal to the actual value. It's inflated, right? It's an inflated value. And you think, oh, these things are going to be great because you're an elk and you don't have a lot to go on. So you make a lot of babies and then it kind of peters out because it turns out that wasn't a good signal. But those birds without the parasites, they're probably still around. So sexual selection is sort of like advertising. Sometimes it's accurate and sometimes it's completely nonsense. And the good thing about natural selection is that if sexual selection gives you a trait that ends up being maladaptive in the long term, it'll eventually get weeded out. But that short-term boost in reproduction can sometimes benefit you. So you have to think not in terms of snapshots, but in terms of long-term survival of a population if you want to gauge how reliable these sexual traits are.
And there's also like a kind of a funky wrinkle, which is that even if it makes you worse at surviving to have these big antlers, say, the fact that you produce offspring that also have the big antlers means that your offspring are also going to be preferred, and their offspring are also going to be preferred. And so it is beneficial to you and to your genes, even though you're like Amy was saying, you're paying a trade-off in survival for a benefit with reproduction.
Within your lifetime. You're not going to know within your lifetime whether or not that was a good choice, so it does get perpetuated on. And occasionally it gets weeded out, occasionally it perpetuates. Right?
Mm-hmm. But this is a hard question. It's not like, this is not something where if you ask a professional evolutionary biologist, they're all going to give you the same good answer. It's still something that where people are really thinking about.
The thing to remember is that there's a threshold of good enough, and evolution does not care beyond that threshold. If you're good enough, you don't need to be perfect. And no, it's not perfect to choose a mate that will more likely be selected by a predator, but it's good enough. And that's something to keep in mind through all of this. Evolution does not care about perfection. It is not an intelligent force. It's just good enough to survive and keep going. Then you get the rubber stamp.
Cool. Any other sexual selection questions? All right, so then the last thing we'll hit on is a little bit about speciation, and then we can do final questions and move to the other room. That one goes really fast. All right. So when I was first talking about Darwin, I brought up that part of the thing he was interested in is how there were all these sort of closely related species that looked different because they were feeding in different ways, and there were these mockingbirds on the different islands. It turned out they were all different species, that these slight variations based on the differences in the environment on these different really close islands. So this production of new species we call speciation, and what we usually talk about in speciation is allopatric speciation. This is the way we think that most speciation happens. So allopatric speciation is speciation that occurs by a splitting of a population into subpopulations that each evolve separately and eventually can no longer interbreed. So the classic image of how this happens is that we start with a big old population hanging out. And then maybe there's an earthquake or usually some other big geological event that occurs. And now all of a sudden we have a river running through. And it just so happens that we're looking at some particular organism, like a mouse, that can't swim across this river. So even though the individuals here are still really close to the individuals here, there's a barrier in between them. So now we have these two populations, and they all started out really similar. But through selection and drift, genetic differences start to accumulate in the two populations. So, and you guys will learn a little bit more about what drift is in the next hour. So now, in the next time step, maybe these mice start to hang out in the grass and get kind of like, are having selection towards a green coat that makes them blend in better. And then these ones like to forage a little bit higher elevation where it's kind of chaparral with red soil, and they start to develop more of a red coat. And as these things are, evolving, there's genetic differences accumulating here, and maybe also from the perspective of sexual selection, there's differences in preferences. Now, they have preferences to mate with other red individuals. Here they have preferences to mate with green individuals. So after some time, the populations get back together. Maybe this river has dried up due to changes in the aquifers and things like that. And now we have this united population again. But it turns out that the red like to mate together and the green like to mate together. And they no longer interact sexually. So they're no longer reproducing with these organisms where they used to be the same species. And now we have two distinct, separate reproducing populations, even though they're in the same place. So, and it doesn't actually have to be that they choose not to reproduce with each other. It might be that when they reproduce, there's some genetic incompatibility and their offspring all die. Or maybe their offspring are some weird color that's just not adapted to anything. And they get very easily picked off by predators. But the point is, there's some reason why there's very few offspring produced that are a hybrid of the two different colors, which are now we're calling species. So that's the principle of allopatric speciation, and this is the way we envision speciation generally happening. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah, sure.
So they're brought back together in the third level? What would bring them back together?
So if it was this river, maybe if the river dried up, if it was a mountain that maybe over the course of hundreds of thousands of years, this mountain is worn away and it's no longer an effective barrier. It can sometimes be like an island and then plates shift, or now it's an ice age and they can access the land again.
And that's enough to prevent them from mating with each other?
Yeah, so it certainly can be, and it seems to be the case that this happens. Oftentimes it happens with, in birds, which I'm more familiar with, it's often about mating preferences, where even similar species today that genetically don't seem to have been separated for that long choose to only mate with those of the same type. Sure.
Can speciation also result from genetic mutations?
Right, so
like even if there's not that barrier, like some kind of geographical, if there's some kind of mutation within the gene.
So there are some slightly out of our depth theories about how this can happen that are very theoretical and not particularly well demonstrated. But generally the problem with that is that when a new mutation arises just within a population, if it makes it so you can't mate with anyone else, then it goes extinct. You somehow need to have some boost to have a certain population of each type to begin with. So it's almost an analogy to the way we were thinking about the trouble of cooperation arising in a group of defectors. It's not beneficial to cooperate all the time if you have no one else who will cooperate with you, because you just get taken advantage of. But maybe if there's a clump of you who cooperate, then you can do okay. And likewise here, it's hard to arise within a population, because when you start out with some new trait and preference that nobody else likes, and you have nobody that you like, you have nowhere to go with it.
And tying back into the cooperation thing, if, say, instead of red and green, the red population became a cooperative social version of a mouse, that it's possible that when they came back together, the red ones would outcompete the green ones, because they would have had an inbreeding kickstart to the cheater defector game theory setup, and they were close enough that they still ate the same food and they still, hung out in the same places, but one group was cooperating and the other wasn't, then bringing those two back together, not only could they not mate with each other because they would have been genetically different and not with that separation, but now the green group would be outcompeted by the red group. So to tie back into the more advanced stuff that we talked about last week.
Cool. Was there another question? Yeah.
So is when's the point that one species turns into two species? Is that when they technically can't mate with each other, or what's the distinction?
It's hard to define, but that's the basic principle. Yeah, when they can't mate with each other, either because they choose not to, or there's physical reasons why they can't, or the offspring they produce are not fit. Yeah.
So that's actually, I think, the definition, because a horse and a mule can make a horse and a donkey can make a mule. Is that They're different species. They can make offspring, but that offspring is infertile. So it's a sort of a vague, nebulous definition, and there's still people working on trying to figure out the actual proximal genetic mechanisms that cause things to become different species. But we don't have a clear answer on that yet. Seems like a simple question, but it's not.
That's what's cool about evolution. It's still like...
There's still a lot of very simple questions.
Yeah, it's still beginning. Any other questions? So yeah, at this point, basically we can just handle any questions people have, and people can start migrating over. The next part is in 370, which is just around the corner, room 370. All right, cool, thanks.
Thank you.